When I first researched Buenos Aires, every blog I found said the same thing. It's insanely cheap. After living there for 4 months in 2025, though, I realized that things have changed. The first thing that you're probably going to be looking at when it comes to cost of living in Buenos Aires is Airbnbs. The Airbnbs in Buenos Aires are actually a reasonable amount for what they are. You can easily find one for about 1,300 Canadian or roughly $950 USD. If you spend that much, you'll definitely find a good Airbnb in a nice area that is close to everything that you need to be close to. I actually only paid $1,150 per month for my Airbnb. That's about $825 USD. And my Airbnb was actually pretty sweet. It didn't have the best view. I was just looking at other apartment buildings across the way. However, it was a decent size, had a nice elevator, and it was in a great neighborhood. There's cafes everywhere, bars everywhere, and it was not far from the public transit. So I was definitely happy with my Airbnb that I was living in when I was down there. Now, compare that to North America. When I was in Toronto, I spent $650 for 2 nights at an Airbnb. So basically double that, and I got a nice place for a month. So it's quite a bit cheaper than North America. Obviously, there's discounts on Airbnb for longer stays, but regardless, you're going to be able to live a lot cheaper down in Argentina than in North America.
I go over anything like ranch. Facts. Think I want a yacht and a ranch. Yes. Hit the boulevard and hit my dance. Everybody wanna be a boss, but they can't. But they motherfucking can't. I go over anything like ranch. Had to tell my old hoes, bon voyage like I'm in France. Hey, now I eat hors d'oeuvres and get them served at my advance. Hey, fuck up my face, please, and thank you in advance. Hey,
now, one thing that I did find really expensive was food and eating out. Now, before I get into this point, I am partly to blame for how expensive it was. I was shopping at one of the higher end grocery stores, if not the highest end grocery store in the city, and that's Jumbo. And I was also buying a lot of imported products. So this definitely drove up grocery prices, but regardless, it was a little more expensive than what I was expecting. For just myself, I roughly spent $600 Canadian a month on groceries. That's about $500 USD per month. Again, this would have been much cheaper if I had stopped buying imported products from America. I had a bad habit of drinking a lot of Red Bull when I was down there, so that definitely drove up my grocery prices. And if I had shopped at local markets, I would have saved a lot of money too. Jumbo is definitely one of the more expensive grocery stores down there. I'd compare it to like a Whole Foods down in the States. So had I have made those two changes, I probably would have saved a lot of money on groceries. Now, another thing that I found really expensive was eating out. Whenever I ate out, I spent about $30 to $75 Canadian, which is about $20 to $55 USD. This, of course, depended on the restaurant that I went to, but this, for the most part, was what I was spending on food when I went to eat out. Now, that's still probably a little bit cheaper than what I'd pay in a North American city like Toronto, but it's definitely a lot more expensive than, say, Peru, for example, where I was spending $10 to $40 when I would eat out, which is about $7 to $30 USD. So for Latin American standards, it's definitely quite a bit more pricier. Now, I do have an idea of why that was and how to avoid it, which I'll talk about shortly. Now, in regards to what you can expect to pay for everything else, phone plans, I didn't really find that cheap, mostly because you couldn't buy like a local plan. You had to buy a tourist plan. And since I was there for 4 months, that didn't really work. The tourist plans didn't have a whole lot of data. And if you wanted a lot of data, it got expensive pretty quick. So I ended up just sticking with my North American phone plan, which ended up costing me an arm and a leg. So if I were to do it all over again, I would have definitely gotten a phone plan down there, but it would have been a hassle to get one. Public transit, on the other hand, is cheap as shit. You can ride the train or the bus or the subway for very little. Honestly, most rides were anywhere from like 70 cents to $2, depending on what mode of transit you're using and how far you're going. But either way, you can pretty well go all over the city for next to nothing. However, Ubers They're definitely a lot cheaper than North America. However, they're not as cheap as, say, Peru. They're kind of in the middle ground. Ubers are kind of like in a gray zone there where they're not fully legal. And I think because of this, it drives up the price a little bit. It's kind of hard to find an Uber, honestly. You'll be waiting for like 5 to 10 minutes before one chooses to pick you up. So that's something to be aware of. Like a 40-minute Uber ride was about $20 to $25 Canadian, which is around $13 to $17 USD. The next point that I want to make is on areas in the city. When I mentioned the way to save on restaurant costs, this is what I was referring to. It pretty well affects every experience that you have in the city. The area that you're in definitely drives up the cost of living. For instance, if you live in Palermo, Puerto Madero, Recoleta, or any of the downtown core or like a touristy area, that's going to be very expensive. Argentina gets a lot of tourists, and I believe that this is what drives up the cost because they all flood to these areas. However, if you go outside of these areas to where the locals live, it's definitely going to be a lot cheaper. For instance, the Airbnb prices that I mentioned earlier in this video were all within these areas that I just mentioned. In fact, mine was in Palermo and I got it for $11.50 a month. However, if I had gone outside of these areas, I would have saved probably $200 to $300 a month on Airbnb costs. The reason I found restaurants so expensive was because of living in Palermo as well. It's one of the most popular areas for going out and eating and going to the bars. So had I gone outside of these neighborhoods to eat out, I definitely would have saved a lot more money as I would have been paying local prices on food. However, being in Palermo, I kind of got shafted with the tourist prices the whole time. My point of this is by moving out of the popular areas, you definitely can save a lot more money if you're trying to live in Buenos Aires on a budget. That said, if you do have the money, the pros of these areas being so walkable and having so many cafes and things to do are definitely going to outweigh the extra costs that you'll be paying to live in them. So if you do have the extra money, I definitely recommend finding a place as your experience in the city is going to be better. So the last thing you need to know when it comes to cost of living in Buenos Aires, Argentina, is that they have multiple exchange rates. There's basically the official rate, and then there's like a black market rate, basically, that's kind of illegal, that's known as the blue rate. To be honest, I never converted any money at the blue rate. I never brought any USD, so I couldn't really do that. So what I ended up doing that still worked out pretty good, it wasn't as good as the blue rate, but it was still a pretty good exchange rate, a lot better than the official rate, was sending money to myself via Western Union. Doing this and then paying in cash saved me a ton of money just because I was able to get a much better exchange rate doing this than with my credit card. That all said, I guess the month that I left, Argentina dropped a lot of the currency control on USD. This is what caused the blue rate in the first place, as people wanted USD to hedge against Argentina's bad inflation. And since it was controlled and hard to get, the blue rate became much more favorable. So now that that currency control is gone, I assume that the blue rate's no longer as favorable. I honestly left the month that these controls were lifted and I didn't know anything about them. I only know about this because when I was doing research for this video, I read about the controls being lifted. So since I left right away, I never noticed the difference, but now it might no longer be favorable to even risk going to somewhere that offers the blue rate. So if it were me and I were going there this year, what I would do is I'd look up the official rate and the blue rate. And if it was still a big difference, I'd probably use it or Western Union like I did this past time. Or if it's not that much more favorable, I just take out cash the traditional way or use credit cards. Now, if you haven't booked a place yet in Argentina and are looking to do so soon, then I definitely recommend checking out this video right here as I go over how I not only choose a country to live in, but the exact neighborhood that I choose to live in. So if it's your first time living in Latin America, I definitely recommend checking that out. The neighborhood can make or break your experience there. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button. I post 2 new videos every single week and you don't want to miss them.